welcome to China Tech Talk, the podcast about technology and startups in China. I am John Artman, editor-in-chief of TechNode.com, joined as always by Matthew Brennan, founder of ChinaChannel. Before we get into today's episode, just a quick plug. If you are interested in receiving daily updates on what's happening in technology in China, just go to technode.com/newsletters for your daily dose of China tech. And of course, if you enjoy the podcast, if you enjoyed this episode, please do make sure that you go to iTunes and leave us a review. If you're on Pocket Casts or Overcast, you can just tap that star button to recommend this episode to your network. So today it is our pleasure to welcome onto the show David Cohen, who is senior editor at TechNode.com. David's been with us for a good period of time already, and he's does some really great work. And one of the big initiatives that he's been spearheading over the last 4 or 5 months has been our coverage of the health code. So that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about, and we brought him on. And so we'll be talking a little bit about what the health code is, and then, of course, looking at bigger questions about what it all means for data privacy, as well as some implications for tech majors in China as well.
Yep, it's a shorter episode, but I think we cover a lot and very timely, obviously. So a lot of this stuff is changing as we talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think it's one of those things, the health code and kind of, the use of technology. China has been a leader in technology adoption, as we all know, for the last several years. But then in particular with COVID-19, not only where was China the first country to really deal with COVID-19, but also because of that, the first country to really implement any technological-based solution to manage the epidemic. But with that, we give you David Cohen. As the coronavirus swept through China, communities, local governments, and businesses have been trying to figure out how to best follow social isolation rules. This being China, of course, tech majors and telcos have jumped at the chance to serve the country by leveraging their vast data pools and rolling out what we now know, or what we now call, the health code. So to discuss this, we're joined by David Cohen, senior editor at TechNode. David, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John and Matt.
So the first question that we like to ask all of our guests is, what's your China story?
Well, for me, it kind of happened. Someone gave me a hedgehog. I was in Beijing in 2007 on my way to Mongolia, some research, and I was wandering around, completely lost in a big concrete park. I think they were planning to install grass or trees later, but there was nothing there. I run across a few, I think they were construction workers. They had old bicycles. And foreigners are still really novel. This is before the Olympics. They come up, they want to have an interaction with me. And they say hello, I say ni hao. That's one of the only 2 Chinese words I spoke at the time, and we were just out of conversation. We had nothing else to say to each other. And one of the guys goes back to his bicycle, and he reaches into the basket, and he pulls out a hedgehog, like living little animal, brings it over to me. I come from California, we don't have them there. I'd never seen one before in my life. And he shows me this hedgehog, and he shows me that you can pet a hedgehog. I didn't know you could pet a hedgehog, but if you do it the right way, they don't stick you. And then he hands it to me. So I'm standing there holding a hedgehog. And after a minute or so, I've had enough, and I want to give it back. And he just refuses. He shakes his hand, waves his hand in front of his face, and he starts walking away. And so there I am in July in a park in Beijing. I need to get on the Trans-Mongolian Railway the next day, and I've got a hedgehog. I don't know what to do with it. I run after the guy shouting, and finally, his friends talk to him, and he takes it back. But I was just amazed by this experience. It was so weird. I thought, okay, I have to understand the hedgehog thing. It must be some kind of ancient Chinese culture. I'm going to learn the language. I'm going to move back here. I'm going to figure out what happened with the hedgehog. It's been, 13 years now. I've never seen another hedgehog in China.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think I've ever seen a hedgehog, period.
Certainly not in China.
No, definitely not in China. So yeah, David, tell us then, what got you to where you are now. So you had that research project in Mongolia, but then you ended up coming back. And so what's kept you here?
Well, I got into journalism pretty quickly. I tried English teaching like everyone does, and I was terrible at it. So more or less had to get into freelancing in order to make a living. And since then, I've been writing and editing about China ever since. It's enormous fun. The country changes so fast, if you get bored of things, wait 2 years, you come back, it's essentially a different country. And, I was a history student in college and enjoyed learning about how society's changed and didn't enjoy spending time in libraries. So I thought, you go to China, you don't have to read about it. You can just watch history happen. And I think it's paid off in those terms.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. So maybe we switch into today's topic, which is the health code, and start off with a really basic question, David. Like, what is it? What is the health code?
Well, if you've been following stories about the social credit system or a lot of tech and governance stories in China, you hear about the government giving everyone a number, giving everyone a code. And that hasn't really happened with social credit. It's a really complicated system. It's really ambitious. It sometimes seems like that's the goal, and a few towns have done it. But I don't have a social credit rating. Most people don't. It's not part of our life. The health code, though. The health code, it's an app or a mini app that you have on your phone. And if you're in a major city, pretty much every single person is rated red, yellow, or green based on how risky the app thinks, how likely the app thinks it is that you have the coronavirus.
I mean, that's kind of the short version of it. But I mean, how is the code actually generated, and what does it mean? I mean, does it mean that you might actually have it? Does it mean that you're at risk of having it? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Okay, so how the code is generated is a pretty complicated question. Let's come back to it. But what it means, essentially, unless you have a green code, you can't pass checkpoints. And there's checkpoints everywhere in China. It helps to understand the whole country is sort of set up on a grid system. Most people live inside a sort of gated community. Offices tend to be in office parks. There's malls. It turns out, and we saw this a couple of months ago, when the government wants to, they can really shut down the country in a very, very tight way, something that's probably hard to imagine if you live in most countries, where you can't really leave your home, you can't get to a shop, you can't get into an office without passing a guard. And once the health code came in, you've needed a green code to pass these guards. So the green code is your pass, basically, to participate in normal life, to get on a train and go to a different city, to be able to attend work, or even to get in and out of your house, depending on how strictly they're enforcing the system. What the code means is we think it seems to be pretty conservative. So certainly under most systems, it seems that anyone who has been to the province of Hubei was the epicenter of the epidemic, where the city of Wuhan is going to get a red code in most parts of the country, although Hubei now has its own code system, which gives some people green and allows them to leave the province. Likewise, we believe that if you live in the same housing compound as a single case of the infection, you're going to be on yellow or red status. So really what the green code is for is identifying people who have basically zero chance of having the virus, who have not been to a city where this community spread for 2 weeks, or who, if they're in that city, who have not been to any place that is associated with any housing compound or office associated with the virus.
So I kind of want to go back to the question that I tried to ask a couple of minutes ago, which is, really, how does it work? How is the code generated? And perhaps even a bigger question is, how accurate do we think it actually is?
So the truth is we don't know. It's a difficult question to attack, first of all, because the governments and the companies that are implementing the code are very opaque. There isn't that much information about it. Second, because there are many, many different codes. There is now talk of a national code system, but most of the codes that we've seen so far are being implemented by cities. So there's a code for Shanghai, code for Hangzhou, code for Beijing, code for Ningbo, which is a smaller city in the same province as Hangzhou. Now, when we first saw the codes, there was absolutely no clue where they came from. You filled out a little intake survey when you joined, and this varied a lot depending on where you were. In Hangzhou, where I was when the codes rolled out, you answered a few questions. Do you have fever symptoms? Where have you been the last few weeks? In Shanghai, there was no intake survey at all. It was apparently all based on information that they could gather about you. Down in Shenzhen, I haven't seen screenshots, but I hear that there was a very long and rather complicated intake survey. Beyond that, there were rumors at first. When we started seeing codes, people were, we know that the code systems were being developed by Alibaba and Tencent, the internet giants in China, and many people figured that they must be using the full range of information that they have about you, which is a lot. In particular, I heard people thinking that they were probably following where you might take out a share bike. You scan a share bike with a QR code, it sees where you are. In order to unlock the bike, you make payments. There's location data associated with those. And then there's government databases of travel information. Most public transport cards in cities have real name ID attached, and certainly when you travel intercity, a train ticket, a plane ticket is going to go into a national travel database. So that's what we were imagining. What it turns out, or what we've been able to verify, we're now looking at a little bit more information. A few weeks ago, a few Chinese regulators released standards for a national code system, which includes diagrams describing how this national code system is supposed to work. And that really it also includes, very interestingly, a list of protocols for transferring health-related data. And that's a list of different types of data that they want to take in. And both of these seem to suggest that actually it's not gathering very much data. It's consulting the National Database of Transport Information, and it's matching that up against records of COVID-19 tests and recent records of fever symptoms reported by local authorities and hospitals. Other than that, plus self-reported travel histories and then basic biographical information, it seems that the code system doesn't actually know very much about you. We've talked to experts, and we're trying to figure out whether we believe this. On the one hand, it could be that there is some other system out there that we haven't seen, but it also seems quite plausible that it really is a very simple system. The basic rule is find the people who haven't been anywhere close to a case and give them a green code.
Yeah, okay. And how long is this going to last for then? I mean, they've been in use for a couple of months now. Has usage been on the increase or the decrease? And do we see this as a long-term sort of development?
So, I mean, but to answer that question, we want to think about two different things. One is the full-on checkpoint system where you show your code 12 times a day in order to get into a market, to get into your office, to get into your house. In most of the country, that system is already on the decline. In where I've been around Shanghai and Zhejiang, it came in very, very fast, but pretty early. Only about 2-3 weeks of lockdown, Hangzhou started to roll out the codes. And that allowed us to get out of our houses and start going around the city being checked. But within a month, guards were getting lazy. Guards were not really checking the code and just sort of waving people by who seemed familiar. And moving on, when you arrive, I went down to Hangzhou about a few weeks ago. When you arrive, you do a check at the train station to arrive in the city. Once you're in the city, no one seemed to be checking anymore. Shanghai has always been more relaxed and is even more relaxed than that. Other cities, I hear Beijing still has more checkpoints, but tendency is towards the decrease. On the other hand, we're seeing new applications or new sort of like special population applications coming out. A big one is Hubei, the epicenter province. It's only been a few weeks that people have been allowed to leave, and that's a very health code-based system. Although we've heard of some pretty big bugs there where people get a green code in Hubei, they are advised that they're able to travel, but then they get somewhere else, and the place they're arriving gives them a red code and says, you can't come in here, you've been to Hubei, are you crazy? So that's caused some real trouble for people trying to resume their normal lives. The other place we've seen an increase in adoption of checking health codes is at schools. Also, over the last month, students have been resuming study all over China, and to support this, mostly seems to be Tencent. As we did a story, our amazing TechNode intern, Sean E., compiled reports that Tencent has developed a system called Fushirema, or Return Study Code, and for that, students report their self-report travel history and health benefits. They're supposed to report temperature every single day, and they need this code in order to go back into a school. We've heard some reports that parents are able to check other students' health data to make sure that their students are safe, but we haven't been able to verify those. Anyway, so that's the checking part of it. The tracking part, the data and the data and code generation part of the system looks like it is going to become permanent. It's just not going to go away. We've seen experts discussing in articles online different ways that the code could be used. We've seen experts associated with companies that are developing codes like Tencent discussing sort of long-term problems of privacy and data management for this system. Also, if you look at the standards, they comment in the introduction to the standards for the national code that in addition to public health, the code has applications to individual healthcare, care for the elderly, and handling other mass activities, which is a phrase we don't quite understand the meaning of. So it does look like now the system's put together, it's probably not coming apart again. And that's not surprising. I mean, we know that the Chinese state doesn't track people nearly as much as it would like to, so I can't see why they would take apart a system that's adding some more tracking.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I would definitely want to come back to this, come back to the issue of tracking and data privacy in general. I mean, it's very concerning to hear that parents might have access to other students' medical information, even if it's only self-reported. But I guess that, before we get into that, I mean, I think the bigger question really, or the bigger discussion point really, is about the actual technology, because it feels like you were just describing how there's been some pretty big bugs in the system. And I was talking to one of our reporters based in Beijing the other day, Wei Sheng. He is from Hubei. His family is from Hubei, and over the May 1st holiday, he decided to go to Qingdao. And getting a train ticket from Beijing to Qingdao was easy peasy. No problems whatsoever. However, after he got to Qingdao and he wanted to go back to Beijing, all the ticketing platforms online ticketing platforms would not let him purchase a ticket because all of his ID information is associated with Hubei. He was even able to call, some of like the railway hotline, as well as some of the hotlines for the apps, and they all said, just go to the ticket desk at the train station to buy your ticket. So he does that, and they say, no, sorry, because your Shenfenzheng says that you're from Hubei, you can't actually buy a ticket and until you submit an application online. And basically the online application was the big problem, and so there was pretty much nothing he could do. And so his only recourse was to go to the quote unquote relevant authorities and report this. And so, using like a day and a half, he was finally actually able to get authorization to buy a train ticket from Qingdao back to Beijing. Now, you have to remember that this is all in the context of Beijing being like the most cautious city in the entire country because it is the capital, and the Chinese government has made it very, very clear that Beijing needs to be protected at all costs. But the thing is, according to any data that would be available about him, whether it's from telecommunications companies in kind of tracking his SIM card, whether it's a national database with travel history and things like that, all of these records would show that he has not been to Hubei. That he has not been to Hubei since probably January, even before January, before all of this was going on. And so in Beijing, he's gone through all the quarantine measures, he's gone through all the precautions and all that stuff. But because his Shenfenzheng still says that he's from Hubei, he still has these issues. So, that's all to say that there's obviously some really big holes in the way the system works. And then, I think another kind of another point that I want to make is that, this is still actually very low tech. And so even though the data being collected, how it's collected, what data is actually being used, it's relatively opaque. The way, like in practice, you still have to, fill out a form for wherever you go. You have to fill out a form, your name, your ID number, your passport number. You have to self-report your temperature, your address, and all these things. And so it's kind of typical China in a certain sense, where like the government and these tech companies, they have this huge vision about this kind of technology-driven way to prevent and control an epidemic. But really, what it comes down to is that there's still these huge problems in terms of implementation, and in part because of those problems, in part because people just don't know how to use the technology necessarily. Everything is still very, very low tech.
Yeah, well, I've heard Wei's story as well, and that's a great illustration of why these systems are concerning. That the systems are much bigger than health code, and as you say, they're low tech, and they're not set up in ways that necessarily are meant to serve the individuals who are being rated. They're set up in order to accomplish these big goals, like keeping the risk in Beijing to zero. And as an individual, you get mixed up in these systems, and it can be pretty harrowing.
Yeah, then as a foreigner, at least, you kind of have to pray that it actually works the way it's supposed to. I've had several occasions where I've done the intake survey, I've sent them a scan of my face. I've sent them a scan of my passport, the mini app. In Beijing, we call it Jiankangbao on WeChat. And even then, there's been times where I've been logged out, or I do all that stuff. It's working fine, and then the next day I try to go somewhere and I try to show my health code and I've been logged out and it doesn't work. So I think that there's still. It's obviously again one of those areas where it's clearly not designed for non-Chinese, or if you don't have a Shenfenzheng, a Chinese ID code, then an ID card and an ID number, then things do get a little bit more complicated and a little bit more harrowing if you don't have everything, if you don't have all your ducks in a row. And sometimes getting those ducks in a row isn't always that straightforward.
Yeah, I think also some context to think about is that this is all an add-on to a governance system that is based on people not moving around. I think if you're going to go between the same office and the same home every day, you're going to be fine whether the health code works or not, because the system is that the people you work for, the people who the committee that sort of the equivalent of the neighborhood watch that administers the place you live, they're responsible for you and they're responsible for their zone. So if they recognize you as a person who lives there, a person who works there, they're going to let you in and out fine. But when you turn up as a stranger to somewhere, and if you're going to a mall, you're turning up as a stranger, then you're a risk. And then a few months ago, the answer was just, you cannot come in here. I don't know who you are. You're probably dangerous. And health code has allowed, in some of these cases, allowed people to come and go about a more sort of a more modern or more mobile style of life that isn't so reliant on these little cells.
Is there anything that other countries can learn from this, China's approach, do you think?
Increasingly I don't think so. It was very successful. And China deserves credit for that. I mean, after an initial real failure to contain the virus at its point of origin, at the time, when I was under lockdown in Hangzhou, I was pretty scared. But I got back out after, I think, less than 2 weeks, or about 2 weeks, and I felt that it had been a very long time to be stuck in my house. But looking at the rest of the world, where it's going on for 2 months, you realize that the extreme way that China completely shut down mobility, completely shut down walking around, going to the street, going to the market, really did work and got the virus under control very quickly. I think the health code really played a vital role in this, that I don't think you could have reopened nearly as quickly before without this way of having this code that allows people to validate this basic stuff about themselves, that they haven't traveled recently, that they don't live with someone who has the virus, and that made it possible for China to keep these checkpoints in place while allowing people to go about their lives. But I don't think it's copyable. I don't think there's any other state in the world that has the capacity to roll out checkpoints and to control where people go every day with the same kind of extraordinarily fine-grained look that the People's Republic has.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to your point about the grid system. The grid system has been in place, for centuries, maybe even millennia in China, and it's a very kind of typical Chinese way of managing society, where there's this kind of top down, what's a good way to say it? It's like a top down system where as you go down, there's more and more granular levels of responsibility and oversight and supervision, and again, a lot of that's based on the assumption and the a system that doesn't really allow much internal movement. I think also, when we're looking at other countries, it's actually really interesting. So we published a piece a couple of weeks ago by Eliza for our members only newsletter. And she was looking at what Europe is doing, and some of the things that Europe is trying to learn from China. And what's interesting is that it really seems that what Europe is doing, what Singapore is doing, it's much more technology based than what China has done. With contact tracing via Bluetooth and smartphones. There's actually real technology going on there, at least consumer technology that we can feel and touch. Whereas in China, it really feels very low tech compared to all of that. Also, I think a broader point about lockdown in China versus the rest of the world. I think that China's, as you said, China's really the only country on the one hand that could actually execute on that, with the grid management system. But then on the other hand, it's probably the only country that could weather that type of lockdown. Whereas we're seeing, very early stages already, EU, Italy, other countries in the EU, the US, they're already starting to relax a lot of the restrictions. Where it does feel that China was very serious for a lot longer than what we're seeing in other countries.
I'm not sure, actually. I mean, the most intense lockdown, I haven't been to Italy, but it seems as though the greatest intensity that we saw outside of Hubei, where I don't know very much about what happened, but in most of the country, the greatest intensity we saw was probably comparable to Italy. And that really only lasted for a few weeks here, where in Italy it's lasted something like 2 months. So I think, in fact, the Italians may deserve more points for patience than our co-residents here. But I guess something to think about, and something I've been thinking about a lot, is that really what the system is for is being able to discriminate among people, being able to divide people into pretty broad groups, and to be able to make decisions saying, okay, people who have been to this place recently, they can't go out. People who live in the same compound as a case, they can't go out. It's very difficult to divide society up that way, but it falls pretty far short of what we try to do, what the Europeans try to do, and what we try to do, which is to make decisions about individuals. In normal governance, certainly, we have a very strong view that it's not okay to make decisions about groups, especially groups of people who come from a certain place. But in these kind of emergencies, that really worked out. That approach, that very, very crude approach to governance, really worked out pretty well, at least as an emergency measure.
One thing we didn't cover was the sort of systems of appeal if you are given a wrong code. How does that work?
So apparently very few. Apparently it doesn't really work. Our reporter Wei Sheng, he has not had code problems, but he has had serious problems with getting around. He also, before the Qingdao incident, he had trouble. Had been scheduled before the virus in the Chinese New Year to move houses, and the authorities at the new apartment building didn't want to let him in for the same reason, because he was from Hubei. In both cases, he had to appeal to the government of Beijing and find somebody who could intervene and recognize that he hadn't been to Hubei and intervene to make things right. So it was a very difficult and cumbersome process. I've heard of people going to local authorities, what's called the shichu, or the community authorities, something which is very local. I think the best comparison I can come up with is a neighborhood watch or neighborhood committee, and asking for them to help figure out how to get a code changed. But normally, in most of the country, they say that if you get a red or a yellow code, it should automatically change to green. I mean, if you get the code, authorities are going to come and check on you, give you tests, and after a few weeks, it should change to green unless you get diagnosed with a disease. In practice, it seems like that doesn't always happen, and some people have had red codes that just lasted for weeks and weeks until they had to go and beg for help.
So, I mean, I guess, we've kind of talked about this already, but I think maybe perhaps this is an interesting way to wrap it up. I mean, David, what do you think that, the health code, but also in some of this offline data collection, what do you think that says about data privacy in China? I mean, there's been a lot of public debate, I think, outside of China, at least among China watchers or China tech watchers, about the state of data privacy. There's been a little bit of a public debate, but I think that it's actually been quite facile in China around data privacy. So what's your take on data privacy and kind of COVID-19 in China?
I mean, I think that what we've seen is an approach that we've seen for a long time, that the Chinese government, Beijing, and increasingly does take data privacy seriously after a series of scandals in which there have been data leaks, some intentional, some not. But when confronted with a problem, the approach is always collect first and ask questions later. Over the course of this epidemic, we've seen a very dramatic and sudden shift, going from the beginning when data collection and monitoring the disease was really entirely done by local authorities using offline paper, WeChat, whatever techniques they could improvise, going into health code. And in the early days, when local authorities were just trying to identify cases, there were quite a few cases of intentional leaks, where an official, a policeman, would text their family members saying, "Hey, there's a case in the neighborhood. Look at his ID card." And of course, people who got their ID cards shared in that way found it humiliating, frightening. People being accused of having a strange and terrifying disease is no fun for anyone. As we've moved into more health code and more centralized systems, there's talk about data privacy. The standards certainly consider it, but these systems are put together really quickly. They were put together mostly by private companies, by Alibaba and Tencent, and we don't really know who has the data, where the data is going. Ali and Tencent say that they don't have any direct view into the data, but they also say that they develop the algorithms themselves. So I find that hard to believe. In the national standards, we have a little bit more of an insight into where the data is going to live. They talk about a national personal health information platform, which is identified as a data controller, and then the code system is supposed to make queries to that platform in order to make individual determinations about people. But I don't know. Putting this together with the longer term trend towards worries about concern about data privacy, I think that we can take it seriously. That China would like to have data private. That they are working hard to write regulations to create data privacy and to change how the government works. But data privacy is constantly running after applications and running after deployment, trying to catch up, which can be a bit like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, David, I think that's about all the time we have. Again, thank you so much for taking the time, even though, I am your boss and you kind of have to. But if people want to find you online, where can they do that? I'm
best found at TechNode.com. I write occasionally, and you can read my writing and reporting on health code there. But you should also read all of the wonderful reporting that has been done by my colleagues.
And what about Twitter?
Twitter, I'm at Martin Van Buren. I spelled it wrong. I was in college. It's MartynVanBuren, but I'm not as engaged as I should be.
I think that's true for most of us. All right, so we're going to leave it there. Again, David, thanks so much.
John, thanks so much for having me, and thanks very much for allowing me to come on once, screw the pooch, and then destroy the efforts.